Well, thank you very much. After that introduction, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. No, you're absolutely wonderful, and what I'd like to do is make some comments, and if you want to get into Q&A, that's absolutely fine. As you all know, I came here to endorse Aubrey Britton. I think that will make all of you happy. And let me, in the process, make some informal comments. First, let me address, if I may, the issue of loyalty. I'm not much on electronics, but after endorsing Tom Horner yesterday, my wife was amazed how many people thought I was one of the worst traders since Benedict Arnold. And I think the issue of loyalty, frankly, is important, and I don't say that flippantly. But the issue becomes, to whom is it that we're loyal? And when you go back and read Madison's Federalist Papers on organizing what ultimately became political parties existed as a mechanism to take power. That's really what they were, an organized effort to take power. And the more ideological parties get, the more narrow they become. And so political parties, particularly in the United States, where they would like to win national elections, tend to focus on what they used to call the broad tent. And if you had an uncomfortable alliance under the tent, you kept your divisions rather private. You take a look at the Democratic Party roughly 1920 on, and you had that very uneasy relationship between the Northern liberal and the South. And in spite of those very, very deep divisions on very fundamental issues, the party held together. And the compromise usually was that the head of the national ticket would be a Northerner, and the number 2 on the ticket would be a Southerner. And then, of course, all the major committees were run by the South. And so it's not an accident that you see all the goodies down south, just as in the state of Minnesota, where seniority was so worshipped, drive the roads of the 8th District. As they say, they're paved with gold. But I would argue that in the last decade or two, the caucus system has become very, very troublesome. I don't know of a single political figure of any political party that runs for office on the slogan of elect me and I'll let my caucus decide my vote. Not one. They all talk about how independent they'll be, how they're going to represent you. And they almost infer you personally. And then they go to Washington, St. Paul, wherever it may be, and the powers to be virtually dictate what the public policy stance will be. And all of a sudden, all dissent is washed away in order to be able to preserve the strength, if you will, of 2 political parties. Having served in the legislature, I can tell you that strain is enormous. You get into things like school aid formulas, where you're supposed to represent your district. And you suddenly find that your district is on the short end of a formula stick and the money is going elsewhere. I mean, let's face it, we all fight about money. Well, what is that representative supposed to do? Walk the line? And for the good old party, drown? But in the process of him taking that risk, what happens to his district? Who, in fact, represented their interests? And the answer is tough luck. And I think that's wrong. And I think when you look at what a role of a state legislator ought to be, is one, yes, they should have a focus on state issues. And by that, when you look back over history, when you talk about, for instance, health care, most legislators come to the table and say, let's talk about what's good for the state, the broad constituencies that form the state. On more narrow issues, like the allocation of highway funds, they almost entirely take a look on my district. And that's natural. That's the tug and pull. And then you get into, well, what is the role of the governor? I've always argued that the governor has the most powerful weapon that any political body can have in its possession. That's called a veto. I mean, think about it. 201 legislators can vote one way, one governor can vote one way, and guess who wins? The governor. Ah, there we go again, everybody's favorite instrument. But I do think it's important for governors on sensitive issues to try to develop proposals with bipartisan input. Try to, if you know your legislative body, try to get people on board early on relative to what you intend to do in those proposals that have an enormous impact on the state as a whole. From there, you can better develop, if you will, a bipartisan approach. Let me now, if I may, briefly talk about the financial, not necessarily in terms of the crisis that we're in today, but what ought the goals to be? Because we hear very little discussion on where it is that we want to go. It's kind of like Alice in Wonderland. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, and that's kind of where we are today. Any road will get us wherever we're going, and we have to have a focus. One, we in Minnesota love quality of life. We haven't fully defined it, but nevertheless we embrace it. And it's a well-known fact that when you leave the border and go into Wisconsin, your quality of life substantially diminishes. So we know we have it. The second thing is you have to have a political system that is highly sensitive to growing jobs and then beginning to understand the underpinning of how that economy works. In Minnesota, we've had to be a bit smarter than the rest. Why? We're out of the main transportation loop of the United States. We're not on the New York, Chicago, LA kind of a run. Two, we have very adverse winters. Three, you're not packed, or we're not packed with natural resources. And whatever we have tend to be located up in the north. And so you have to take a look at what is your asset base. And the asset base tends overall to focus largely on our capacity through the University of Minnesota and other research institutions to be able to excel in certain fields of research that manifests and ultimately produces companies, et cetera, that grow and prosper in Minnesota. The second is the feeder system, and the feeder system is the broad educational system as a whole. And there the philosophy has to be several. One is you want your excellent students to excel. So you do want to focus on excellence. And on the other side, you cannot afford to have any child not have the opportunity to achieve their highest level of competence. And I think you have to define how those mechanisms are going to operate. Thirdly, you have to create a climate that is conducive to business and job growth. It gets you into a variety of issues, but largely taxes and regulatory climate and other costs. And that third one is the one that we all too infrequently actually discuss. But things like workers' comp, unemployment comp, et cetera. Increasingly, of course, is healthcare. On the financial side, business particularly likes a state that has financial stability. This is another item that has been missing from public discussion. When any business looks at a graph and begins to see this, that tells you that's a state to stay away from. Because if they can't manage their books, we're not going to trust them on anything else. And so stability and predictability are very, very important. And one of the problems that you run into, and clearly it started in 2003 with convenient political decisions, were also very inconvenient decisions for business. And that is when you start to misuse your power over the budget. bear in mind the budgetary constraints on government tend to be a lot looser than they are in the private sector. And when you start to take a look at the early stages of how Minnesota managed to work itself into its difficulties, it's frankly very simple. I would argue that it started in the second term when Jesse Ventura was governor of the state of Minnesota, and you might recall he came out with what he called the bold, what's it called, the big plan or the bold plan? I'm not sure. But suffice it to say it was both big and bold. Well, there are a lot of big and bold things that you can do in life. I think it would be big and bold to invade Mexico. But I'm not so sure it would be terribly intelligent. And sadly, we didn't focus on the intelligence. But more than that, we didn't focus on a lot of other things. Once you get into the business of subsidizing the property tax, watch out. I'll guarantee you it's a black hole. And that's exactly what happened. And nobody anticipated the ripple effects and the consequences of that action. So instead of running numbers out 2, 4, 6 years, they took a look at the moment, glorified the moment, and said, isn't this wonderful? Now, in fairness to the governor, he also wanted a trade-off on the revenue side. And at that time, both of the majority leaders were running for governor. Roger Moe on the Democrat side and Tim Plenty on the Republican side. And when you mention tax increase, no dice. And I'll never forget Tim Plenty's quote because it struck me as so odd. And his quote was, "We will grow out of this." Well, we sure did. The result was that in 2003, if I recall correctly, in order to balance the now unbalanced budget, $1 billion was transferred from the Tobacco Endowment Fund into balancing. Now think about it, $1 billion. That's 10 piles of $100 million. That was to be an endowment. All the rhetoric that surrounded tobacco lawsuits on how we're going to tuck this money aside and we're going to use it for general purposes of health, specifically tobacco, the addiction to tobacco, etc. But imagine in those days you could at least get a 10% return on your money. That would have generated $100 million a year. And instead of putting that into the general fund, you could have put it into dedicated research, all sorts of things. Imagine what that would have done to incentivize certain types of research projects at the University of Minnesota or the Mayo Clinic. Imagine what it would have done in the area of broad public health. All these things. But the tragedy of that was that it was a blatant political move, and sadly, the balance of the system said nothing. You're hard put to find editorials that were critical. You're hard put to find columns that were critical. You're hard put, frankly, to find anybody that was overly critical. The butter would just simply spread over the toast, covered it, and all the rest of us sat back and said, oh, I guess that's the way it is. But from there on in, we never recovered. We were now going down the slippery slope. And each and every year, there was a budget crunch, and there always was. And people forget. Republicans like to talk about the great prosperity of George Bush, and there were many years of absolutely wonderful prosperity. How come Minnesota was always reporting a deficit? And how come we haven't even discussed that? Why were we running deficits in 03, 04, 05, etc.? And the answer was we dug ourselves a hole, and we couldn't get out of it. And so we kept feeding and feeding. And what did we feed it? We fed it one-time money. And then finally, in this last session, we started to feed it with more borrowing. This time going to the school districts, etc. So $1.9 billion, if I recall correctly, was shifted from the schools back into the general fund. Now our political leadership can say, gee, we balanced the budget, aren't we wonderful? And then, sail on to Washington. But it's not so wonderful. 20% of that settlement, 20% involved spending cuts. 80% was a deferral of one type or another, which I we categorize as debt. And so now we have candidates, and they're all stuck, legislative, gubernatorial. Big question is, well, now that we're in this mess, how do we get out of it? As if there's going to be some simple and painless answer, and there isn't. And I think what we're seeing from the three candidates for governor is within the realm of the possible. I think they're being about as specific as they can be without digging their own political grave. So I'm going to give them a lot of latitude. But by and large, we the public get the idea of how it's going to work. One side is going to say you're going to raise taxes, the other side says we're going to cut the daylights, and the other one says we're going to do a little bit of both. And that's kind of the way the choice is going to ultimately filter out. But the truth is, that is not going to solve the problem. That's a piece, and it's a big piece. The next piece comes when you look in the out years, and you have a structural deficit that's anticipated to be about 1.5% of the general fund, so let's say 1.5% of 32, whatever the billions of dollars it will be. So you're going to be sitting around in the legislature, and Audrey, I don't empathize with you at all, or I do empathize with you. You're going to be sitting down, every time you come back into session, you're going to be talking about, oh my gosh, we're short another $400 million on the low side, probably 600-700, if you will, on the high side. So you're not going to get all that pleasant news of talking about this marvelous surplus and how do we spend the surplus. No, we're going to be talking about deficits more. Then the question will become, how do we keep this enormous system financially alive? And there, the answers get more controversial. Government ultimately, regardless of what you feel today, is going to have to learn to redesign itself and to do it within the confines of what it can afford. And we got to start asking ourselves some fairly tough questions, just as we do when our wages are diminishing. We have to tighten our family budget. We have to raise some questions about where are our priorities. From a very simple perspective, we have roughly 460 some odd school districts. Can we afford that? That's a lot of administration, a lot of costs attached to that. We have about 490 police departments. That's a bag load. There's administration on top of that. If you live in the city of Minneapolis, you got a lot of protection. You have a local police department, you have a park police department, you have a transportation police department, and if that isn't adequate, you've got a county sheriff to protect you. So they got 4 administrative levels of police to give them all that wonderful protection. Right here where we stand today, we have a county system and we have a city system, and we pay for both. And when you go into the more rural areas of Minnesota, they basically have the same thing. And so government came up with a wonderful solution. We'll invent state aids and we'll disperse money, etc. And that's a very fine notion. I'm not being sarcastic about it. It's a wonderful notion. But at some point, it starts to come back and give us diminishing returns. So now we hear all this talk about local control. Local control is important. Oh yeah, all right, fine, you can have local control. Problem is you got to pay for it. Oh no, that's not what I had in mind. Somebody else is going to pay for it. And that's kind of where we are. And I'm not suggesting the end of LGAs or AIDS or anything else, because there is a tremendous disparity in wealth, income, etc. But what I am saying is that we're going to have to take a look and bring together some creative teams and figure out how do we redesign government. One, it's got to meet the mission of affordability. If it's not affordable, it's not going to work. So it's got to be affordable. 2, it's got to stay within the philosophical confines that we spoke about here. It's not going to diminish our quality of life, etc. So that's another one. And the outcomes have to equal what we just talked about. Now, that gets us to something. We have so many people in the state that have been dying for this opportunity of transition. Kurt Johnson comes to mind, Ted Goldman. They've been sitting around for 20 years waiting for somebody to give them a call, help us redesign government. The old Citizens League was marvelous at it. They had committees on transportation, environment, you name it. Business leaders came, labor leaders came, everybody participated. And when you look at the 60s was just a constant bubbling of creativity. The whole metropolitan governance came out of it. We were very willing as a state to redesign. Now the time has come to do precisely the same thing. What may have worked in 1960 may not be totally operable today. That's okay, that's the way it goes. I used to be able to play a darn good second base, but nobody's drafting me now. But that's the way it is. And I think we should see this as an opportunity. One, it's an opportunity to redesign our finances. This nonsense that we can allow a governor to come into office, one, throw away the idea that we can plan 6 years out and say, no, we'll just go 2 with a little wrinkle here and there, we may get to 4. The truth is, if you figure this out, look, a legislator comes in with a bill and they say, this is a great bill. It's going to cost $20 million. All right, that's fine. What is that going to cost 3 years from now? It's not going to be $20 million. One is, it's going to be in effect for 2 years. So that may double the cost to 40. Then you've got the possibility of expansion, growth, and rising inflationary costs. So all of a sudden, what you thought was 20 million now is closer to 50. Now, a good budget says, okay, today 20, tomorrow 40, the day after 50. And you start to project out. Congress used to have a wonderful system because they have access to deficit spending. And this was a marvelous agreement arrived at by Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton. And one of the pieces of the agreement was, if you want to bring in a bill that expends a certain amount of money, then tell us what you can do on the revenue side. Either cut or raise taxes. Now, that has a dampening effect. The problem with that approach, and there is a problem, is it doesn't deal fairly with emerging needs. It tends to be protective of the status quo. And so you've got to have a legislative body, and particularly in this case a president or a governor, that is much more sensitive to emerging needs and is willing to say, this need has now less value than it had 50 years ago. This one has a rising need, and therefore it will go up. So you see the budget in flexible terms. Now, let me, in that context, talk briefly about the role of the legislature and the role of a governor and the role that Audrey and her colleagues will assume. First of all, in spite of the loyalty that there is to the caucus, the reality is legislatures cannot govern. They were never designed to govern. They weren't even designed to be good in the proposal business. The reason they have 150 leaders, you notice when you look at caucus leader, virtually everybody is an assistant minority leader or assistant majority. Part of that is to pepper up the titles and make it look back home. But the other part is to keep everybody disciplined. But the truth is, when the tire hits the road, it's like herding 201 cats. And you can't do it. So who is it that can do it? It's always the office of the governor. Always. They have access to the best research. They have endless access through agencies to be able to influence in committee by committee through their representation, their policies. And they control the flow of information. And so it's imperative, because the question always comes up when you have a three-way race for governor and you have all, why should I elect you because you're a Democrat and you got to work with a Republican governor and blah, blah, blah. All the myths of politics largely are nothing more than myths. The truth of the matter is the way the system should work is the way we can make it work. And that is that every bill should rest on its own merits and not because it has some partisan value to somebody. And I think you really have to have an environment between the governor's office and the legislature that rests on several notions. The Star Tribune has done some work on this, and I liked it very much. One is you've got to have a staff that has credibility with the legislature. The legislature has a perfect right to ask a question, and they have a perfect right to trust the answer. And all too often, governors have taken a very careless approach, and staff truly doesn't know where the governor is at. I remember one time I was in the legislature, Peggy Byrne, I think Dane Smith may recall Peggy, she was literally standing on the floor carrying a bill for the governor when she got a piece of paper from the governor's office saying we no longer support this. Oops is right. Now, you got to have staff trust between the governor, the legislative staff, and the legislature. Two, you've got to, you really have to put aside these hard ideological thoughts, because they will get you nowhere. Let them in. You know, if a legislator wants to bet about something, let them bet about something. It's inconsequential. The key thing is to always make them believe that they are players. Because the fact of the matter is, they are players. They were elected by a constituency to serve their public, and the office of the governor has a responsibility to be very respectful to them. I would advise both sides of an argument to stay away from name calling. It's very, very tempting, and I know as a legislator I did a lot of it, but it's not wise, and it does come back to haunt you sometimes. But we live in a time, particularly with the age of television and electronics, where a lot of our disagreements are now extremely personal, and we're demonizing the messenger in order to weaken the impact of the message, and that's not a good political climate in which to work. So when you elect a legislator, the truth is you elect a legislator on the grounds that that person has overall a lot of integrity, a lot of character, and a lot of good judgment. Because it's hard for you or me or anybody to anticipate fully what's going to happen tomorrow. The reason that I support Audrey, and I support her very strongly, is because we need courage, and I mean it. We have a political system. You know, it's like the old prayer of St. Augustine, who had a penchant for women. Oh, Lord, make me pure, but not yet. And legislators, unfortunately, we have way too many in our political system on both sides of the aisle who will do virtually anything to protect their incumbency. But will they take 1 ounce of risk for the greater good? Absolutely not. And let me give you one that absolutely infuriates me. In February of 2009, the legislature, on a bipartisan basis, passed a bill requiring the governor of the state of Minnesota to submit a balanced budget with the balanced budget that normally comes in January and for the out years of 2012 and 2013. That never occurred. And frankly, both political parties were amazingly silent. There were some efforts on the Senate DFL side, but overall, it was an amazing amount of silence. And I don't understand the media's protection of that either. I can't recall, and I may be wrong, one single article that talked about it. I remember when I got a speeding ticket in Wisconsin. I got back to the residence, there's CCO with their big, up there, you know. You would have thought I personally invaded Wisconsin and stole the treasury. But that's wrong. Because once you start with that, what's next? There's laws, for instance, that govern timetables for submission of certain documents to the legislature. Does the governor have the power? Let's say a new governor gets elected, and that will happen. And the requirement, I think, is the 3rd week in February for the first budget. After there, it goes into January. But suffice to say, let's say, for the sake of discussion, it's February 23rd. Suppose the governor says, you know, this is a real toughie. No dice. There'll be no budget. What are we supposed to do then? Then he can point back and say, well, look, my predecessor got away with it. Why should I bother? The media can't criticize you. You were silent there. Parties can't criticize because you were silent there. But Audrey wasn't silent. I like that. I like it. I like a healthy sense of outrage. But more than anything else, you've got to have an open, pragmatic mind. I mean it. I don't want to preach or anything else. I don't blame people for having certain rigidities in their philosophy. But we are in, I believe, the worst pickle we've been in since I've been around. I was introduced with $1 billion shortfall. That's not quite accurate. It approached 2.5, and it kept getting progressively worse. And the reason it got worse is there are a lot of funds in the state of Minnesota that are not reported through the central accounting system. One of them was we found out we had no money to run the governor's residence. That was gone. The wine cellar was empty. Absolutely true. And I believe, I may be mistaken, and Dane Smith may recall it, but I think we were short money on the governor's staff. I remember the workers' comp fund was depleted. The unemployment, all these little funds were depleted, and they have a habit of adding up, and here you are, you're in office in January, and you got to get through June 30th, and you're beginning to find, oh my gosh. And I think within a matter of days, we had to cut the budget by 300 and some odd million anyway to get into the second phase. I remember we went through, the budget, by the way, is a 2,000-page budget. It's 4 inches thick. We went through it line by line. The reason I got involved in the film board was not because I loved Hollywood, but I do remember as a legislator them coming in and saying, give us money and our needs will expire after X number of years. So I saw it was on there with an item and I crossed it out and I said, why? And that's when I got familiar with the film board. And then I found out they made a bag load of money and much of it landed up in our laps, and I said, that's a wonderful thing. But that's how detailed you start to get. And so I think it's imperative that we have pragmatic people that are willing to work together. You know who it was who really rescued the first part of my political life? It was Wayne Simino, a Democrat. Why? Workers' compensation. We were going through a muddled mess on the budget. I was making mistakes and I was under constant attack. And by the way, I was under constant attack by those people who created the deficit. So it was not a very pleasant year. But we decided we had to get workers' comp because we had too many businesses that were on the threshold of leaving. And so we made a deal. We said, I'll tell you what, you hang on and we'll get workers' comp. And the answer I always got back is, well, every governor said that, you never did it, so why should we believe it? So we said, I'll tell you what, June 30th. We don't deliver by June 30th, you go to North Dakota, South Dakota, you go. Wayne Simino was the one, because the Democrats controlled both houses, that helped us put together a bipartisan team in the legislature, working with the administration, working with the Chamber of Commerce, working with labor. I want to say it was a honeymoon. I don't want to say it was a love-in, but it was a live-in. And it passed. And from that point on, we led the nation in job growth. I mean, it was an incredible spurt. We were dumbfounded by how fast it went. And it was really that started to speed up the process of recovery. It wasn't tax cuts or any kind of inducements to spend. It was, frankly, it was workers' comp. But my point is, when I was at a weak political point, it was a Democrat who came up and said, I will take the lead on this one. And I loved it. And I'll tell you one other story that will make you Democrats happy. I can just throw out so many insults. I remember on the health care bill, it was a wonderful effort because, you know, we got pilloried in 1991 for vetoing the big bill, which, by the way, had a $500 million deficit, and it had language that said the governor shall come back in January with a revenue source. Oh, that's a beauty. Woo! So they were going to hang me in June and then re-hang me again in January. And a person who never got credit was Marlene Marshall. I don't know how many of you ever got to know her. She was Commissioner of Health. I ran across her because it was a marvelous story on her in the St. Paul Pioneer Press of a student working her way through nursing school. and then rising up from the ranks in every single aspect of health care until she was the administrator of the Ramsey County Hospital. I said, that's the background that we want. And she came in. And she was very quiet and just a lovely person. I said, look, I just want a relatively small health care bill that we can afford. I mean, we were broke. So she came back. But the first thing she did, which I thought was very intriguing, was bring in staff leadership from both sides of the aisle. He started to talk about what's possible, what's doable, where should the central focus be, all those kinds of things. And I think everybody was surprised when she reported out through our office on what the bill was. And then we built a bipartisan coalition with the legislature, and before you know it, it was one huge love-in when the bill came out and was going into both houses for votes. But I remember getting a call from Dee Long, the Speaker of the House, and she said, you know, you're short some Republican votes, and I don't know if we can pass the bill. Well, how many votes are we short? I think it was something like 7. And I said, look, I'll make you a deal. I'll do as much arm twisting as I can, but frankly, I can't guarantee many more Republican votes, because Republicans, frankly, were not very supportive of it. But I said, if you want to get me on some other smaller bill. Please don't do it with health care. And she thought for a moment, she said, okay, you go do your best, we'll get this thing out of here. And I think one of the reasons we have health care is because Dee Long had the political courage to know what was big and right as opposed to what was small and partisan. And that's the kind of leadership that I think we need, because you get things done. And so in electing Audrey, you're electing a very pragmatic person with good judgment, tremendous ability to work hard, but a natural at reaching across the aisles. And you've got to do that. We've got to get the legislature back to the point where people can honestly like each other, express differences on philosophy, programs, whatever it may be, but do it in a fun fashion. And I will tell you this, I'm going to devote some time to get rid of all those laws that were passed that kind of forbid legislators from coming together and having a meal. It's absurd. It is truly absurd. I think it's so important for people to get to know people. I mean, gosh, I came out of New York City. I really shouldn't say this, but what the heck. And, you know, I was born in the Bronx. You know, we knew that all farmers were clearly dumb. It was part of our culture. They were. And by the way, don't be so virtuous. What did farmers think of the city slickers from New York City? We're a bunch of con men. And I remember as a freshman legislator going into the first, they had these orientation lectures on the budget, and a fellow named Dick Fitzsimmons, I'll never forget, he was a farmer from Northwest, and he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and he had a bad left arm as a result of a farm accident. And he gets up there and he starts to talk about the budget. Well, first of all, think about it. It's pretty awesome to have a legislator get up and no notes talk about the budget. Then he pulls out this blackboard with chalk and starts to go through it. And I said, well, I can follow this. That's okay. That's fine. Then he started to get into the transfers. And I said, well, let's get a little complicated here. Boom, bada, boom, bada, boom. Then he talks about those aid formulas. Oh, my God. He said, look, if this guy is a farmer and dumb, what am I? But you learn so much. You really do. Those social events are so wonderful in terms of just bringing people together, particularly rural and non-rural, Democrats and Republicans, and you begin to form relationships and a fondness. And when you look back over all the great legislators throughout all of American history, they were people who had the remarkable ability just to like people and to respect people and to be respectful of differences of opinion. And I'd rather see the ideology lowered and both political parties do what they used to do, because Minnesota had rich political parties. When the Democrats had George Farr and Republicans had Bob Forsythe, I think we were in our heyday. They were fabulous humorists. They loved to debate, and frankly, they could pack any house because they were a total delight. But you know what? Think of all the greatness that came out of those people. Think of how all of Minneapolis downtown was built during that period of time. People had vision. There was collaboration. There was pride. And when Wendell Anderson had his picture on Time magazine, we Republicans knew one thing. He didn't catch that fish. And I think we were right. But we knew another thing, and that was as Minnesotans, we've arrived, we've been recognized. And that's important. So I'd like to see us get back into those days, if you will, of greatness. I think they're ahead of us. I think Audrey will be an incredibly fine contribution to the legislature. Audrey, my best to you. Thanks.
I just asked, I said, do you want to do some Q&A? And he said, whatever you want. So do you guys want to do Q&A or do you want to hear from me? The correct answer is hear from me maybe for a little bit. And then if the governor will come back up, that'd be great. Of course, Governor, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight, taking time out of your amazingly hectic schedule, and of course for your remarks, which I think most everybody here is in agreement with, and I think that's why we're here. I've had a few weeks to think about how to thank you for your support and your endorsement, and I tell you, there are no words. How do you thank someone who's been your personal hero for 20 years? Not, he's still a young guy, still going, but I've always seen the governor as a. By the way, we didn't plan our speeches together, so he's up here saying things that I'm like, well, I'm going to say that too. But I've seen the governor as a pragmatic, deep thinker who has always put Minnesota first, and he continues to do so. He's working, 90 hours a week. So just thank you for your service. Thank you for being such a great public servant. So the governor and I first met to discuss his ideas on tackling the state's budget crisis, and I've met with others without regard to party affiliation. I'm a big believer that you need to get ideas from everybody, and as you just heard, he has great knowledge in this area. But I do want to say something. During those conversations, I had never met the governor in person before, and within, I'm going to give it 3 minutes, I said, oh my gosh, he is really a Republican. And I thought, if he's not a Republican, then who is? But I also learned he still cares deeply about doing what's right for our state. He remains focused on sensible solutions, which indicates to me someone who is a moderate. So now I'm a Democrat, no surprise there, and I'm a moderate. And I have joked with my team for months that I'm so moderate, I'm boring. I said, you guys, we are not going to be out there with a big splash with crazy, wild ideas. I'm a roll up your sleeves, focus on solutions, get the job done. Well, we have some members of the media here tonight, and who would have ever known we're on the news because I'm a moderate? That didn't even occur to me. But so I meet with Republicans, I meet with Democrats, and there's this push and pull in our conversations. And that push and pull is a good thing. And I always feel like it's right about here. It's necessary. It's the same push and pull in the conversations that the parties have or should have. It's the same push and pull that you have in the branches of our government. It's necessary, it's a good thing, and in my opinion, it's meant to bring about balance. Now, there's a difference between push and pull here and pull here. When we get out to the extremes, that's no longer push and pull, that's tear and divide. And we absolutely need to get back to the center. And what I'm seeing a lot of is the more someone goes one way, the more the other person goes the other way. And we do need to stop thinking about, is the person a Republican, an independent, religious affiliations, whatever it is. I agree. You'll be amazed when you sit down and actually talk to people. You have a lot in common, even though you might not think that at first, and you might be a little resistant to sit down with someone. Okay, I'm totally off my speech right now, I'll admit. So I truly believe if we're to develop sensible, realistic solutions to our most pressing issues, one, the answers are in the middle. Two, that the ideas of many are always going to be better than the ideas of one. And that's actually been scientifically proven, and we'll talk about that some other night. If people are in office just voting how one person tells them to vote, that's not about solutions. That's not leadership. For goodness sake, I don't even think that's representative government. Many others feel the same way. And, you know, for some reason, the last few weeks especially, we're out at the doors every day meeting literally thousands of voters. And I feel people are just hungry for this moderation. They want us to get back to doing the business of the state. They want to be represented. And I want to read... And Governor, we got a lot of emails coming in after this event was announced. More than anything, people were asking me, what is he going to announce? And I said, I don't know, maybe he's going to predict the, you know, you're a big sports fan, what's going to happen with the Gophers. So I said, come on and, you know, and find out. But here's one, and of course, tons of accolades for you. Other people were also writing in, and I want to read just one of them. It's very short, but it, you know, multiply this by 10 people. I love it that you and Governor Carlson are meeting. It is such a relief to hear about people running for office who actually are interested in solving problems rather than just creating division by clinging blindly to ideology. I wish there were more of you. So I wish there were more Governor Carlsons, and I plan on finding more and more people like him as I move into office. So in closing, I need to answer the burning question that everybody seems to have. Is there such thing as a tight-fisted Democrat? And in my campaign, we've been focusing on three things: fiscal responsibility, jobs in the economy, and education. And when I talk about jobs in the economy and education, everyone seems to get that. You know, they're all right with that. But when I talk about fiscal responsibility, the people on the far left are really suspicious of me. And the people on the far right just think I'm out and out lying. So maybe I can prove this with a story. I was a consultant, and I was leading a team of about 20 people, and I was to manage the budget. I did manage the budget. And one of the people, who was probably the most quiet person in the group, pulled me aside one day, and this is in a work setting. He said to me, "You're Dutch, aren't you?" And I thought, that is really a weird question for me at work right now. So I didn't answer his question. Instead, I asked him why he was asking. And he said, well, you manage the budget so tightly. I said, okay, what does this have to do with me being Dutch? Or what about your question about if I'm Dutch? And he said, well, you know how copper wire was invented? It was two Dutch people fighting over a penny. So I guess I was born this way, you guys. I mean, it is possible. The thing is, we need to prioritize our spending. We need to ensure that every dollar that we entrust to our government is spent wisely. And we need to be effective and efficient in our operations. And I don't think that's Republican or Democrat. I think that this is something we can all agree on and we all need to get to work on right away. And I want to tell you, you know, I'm a first-time candidate. Last March, when I was told you got to pick 3 issues and then stick with those issues, and that's what you talk about, I said, great, I want to talk about fiscal responsibility. They said, oh, no, not that issue. You know, it might not be popular, but I am not in this to be popular. I'm in this to be practical and to get the job done. I'm not in this for me. I'm not in this for any political party. I am in this for all of us. And when I go to the legislature, I represent every single person in my district. And let me tell you something else. I also understand there's not a 20-foot wall around District 43A, Plymouth and Medicine Lake. The votes that we take for our district, absolutely. I have a daydream of standing on the House floor and being able to say, I have talked to literally thousands of people in my district. This is where we want to go. But my district also understands, and they do, because I've been at the doors and I've heard it, that the votes taken in our district, even though it might have nothing to do with our district, we care about how it affects greater Minnesota. We understand that we are citizens of the state. So now I'm going to say something I have literally said over 1,000 times because we have a really great database management team. And that is, I will work with everybody and anybody who wants to roll up their sleeves, focus on solutions, and get the job done. Oh, I was looking for Sharon. She's right there. So, and by the way, I am Dutch. So.